Before you scroll away, pause for a moment and breathe. What you are about to read is not just another story about love, loss, or destiny. It is about a message that almost never existed. A message written in silence, rewritten in doubt, and finally sent with a courage that arrived years late but exactly on time. Somewhere tonight, in a quiet room lit only by the glow of a phone screen, someone is staring at your name. Their thumb hovers over a message they have typed and erased more times than they can count. The words are simple. The emotions are not. They never imagined they would reach this point. In fact, they convinced themselves they never would. This is not a message filled with blame. It is not written in anger. It does not ask for sympathy or forgiveness. It carries something heavier and yet lighter at the same time. It carries truth. For a long time, they believed silence was the kindest choice. They told themselves that stepping back was an act of maturity. That disappearing quietly would make everything easier for you. That if they stayed away long enough, their feelings would shrink into something manageable. But feelings do not disappear just because they are ignored. They wait. They gather strength in the quiet. They grow roots in places you cannot see. There was a reason they stopped explaining. Every unfinished conversation, every time they changed the subject, every smile that did not quite reach their eyes, it all hid one simple truth. They were afraid that if they spoke honestly, they would lose you completely. And losing you completely felt more terrifying than living in uncertainty. So they chose distance. They chose quiet goodbyes that were never officially said. They chose to pretend that moving on was easier than admitting they never truly wanted to. While the world believed they had already forgotten, they were doing something very different. They were collecting memories. Small ones. Insignificant ones. The way you laughed at your own jokes. The way you paused before replying when you were thinking carefully. The way ordinary days felt slightly less ordinary when you were part of them. Every place carried echoes. A street corner. A cafe. A song that played at the wrong time and suddenly brought everything back. They tried to convince themselves it was nostalgia. That it would fade. It did not. Instead, they began writing. Late at night, when the world was quiet and distractions were gone, they wrote the things they never said. Pages of words that would never be sent. Confessions that felt too heavy to share. Questions they were afraid to ask. They deleted those words. Then wrote them again. Softer this time. Then stronger. Then simpler. Until one message remained. A message that did not try to impress. Did not try to dramatize. Did not try to rewrite the past. It simply tried to be honest. Imagine receiving a notification on an ordinary evening. No music. No warning. Just a small vibration in your hand. You look down. You see their name. Your heart does something strange. Not fast. Not slow. Just different. You open it. The first line does not begin with, "I'm sorry." It says, "If you are reading this, thank you for giving my words a chance." It is such a gentle sentence. Yet it carries years of hesitation behind it. The message continues. They admit that every goodbye they ever gave was incomplete. That a part of them always believed there would be another hello. That pretending to be unaffected required more strength than they actually had. They confess that there were countless moments when they almost reached out. On birthdays. On quiet Sundays. On nights when something good happened and you were the first person they wanted to tell. Each time, fear whispered the same thing: wait one more day. One more day turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Months into a version of life where silence became normal. But normal does not always mean right. Then comes a memory. Not a dramatic one. Not a perfect one. Just a quiet moment. A conversation that lasted only a few minutes. A look that held more meaning than either of you acknowledged at the time. They reveal that this memory never left them. That it became the reason they could never fully let go. Because in that moment, something real existed. Something unplanned and unguarded. And real things are difficult to erase. The message pauses. Then it continues with a line that changes everything. I never stayed silent because I stopped caring. I stayed silent because I believed my words would complicate your life. Read that again. Suddenly, every unanswered text. Every delayed reply. Every unexplained distance begins to rearrange itself into a different story. They were not indifferent. They were afraid. Afraid of becoming a burden. Afraid of reopening wounds. Afraid that speaking honestly would push you further away instead of bringing you closer. So they chose what felt like the safer path. Silence. But silence has a cost. It steals clarity. It builds assumptions. It turns small misunderstandings into permanent distance. They admit that they imagined every possible ending before writing this message. Some ended beautifully. Some ended painfully. But the one ending they feared most was becoming a stranger to you. So they risked it. They opened an old note they had saved long ago. A promise to themselves. That if they were ever given another chance to speak truthfully, they would not let fear decide for them. Tonight, they are keeping that promise. The next line is simple. Every future I imagined somehow still included you. There is no demand attached to it. No expectation. Just a confession. They explain that whenever something meaningful happened, the first instinct was always the same: I wish I could tell you this. That instinct never disappeared. No matter how much time passed. No matter how much life changed. They clarify something important. This message is not written to bring back the past. It is not an attempt to erase mistakes or rewrite history. It is written so that nothing remains hidden anymore. Then comes the line that lingers long after the screen dims. If our story still has one page left, I hope this message becomes the first word on it. No pressure. No ultimatums. Just hope. After reading it, silence returns. But this silence feels different. It does not feel empty. It feels full. Full of possibility. Full of clarity. Full of the kind of peace that only truth can create. At the very top of the message, there is a date. Not today's date. The date it was first written. Months ago. That means this was not impulsive. Not emotional chaos. It was thoughtful. Considered. Revised again and again until every word reflected something steady. There is no bitterness in it. No hidden blame between the lines. Only gratitude for what was shared. Only acknowledgement of what was real. Another line stands out. Some connections leave marks that time cannot erase. You realize this message was never about changing your mind. It was about freeing their heart. The phone asks a simple question. Keep this message? It seems small. But it carries weight. Because some messages are temporary. And some become part of who you are. You read it again. Slower this time. You notice something you missed before. The tone is not desperate. It is calm. As if the act of sending it already brought relief. And that is the real turning point. The greatest surprise was never inside the message. It was the courage it took to send it. For years, fear had the louder voice. Fear of rejection. Fear of awkwardness. Fear of final endings. But tonight, honesty spoke louder. The story does not end with whether you reply. It does not depend on what happens next. Because the true transformation already happened. A heart that once hid everything chose transparency. A person who once avoided vulnerability chose openness. That choice matters. Days pass. The message still lingers in your mind. Not because it demanded attention, but because it offered something rare. Complete sincerity. You begin to realize that sometimes the most powerful act of love is not holding on. It is telling the truth without expecting anything in return. And maybe that is what this was. Not a plea. Not a strategy. Not a dramatic finale. Just truth. The kind of truth that sets both people free. In the end, the biggest revelation is this: the message was never meant to change you. It was meant to change the one who sent it. Because living with unspoken words is heavier than risking an honest one. Some stories end with fireworks. Some with silence. This one ends with clarity. Two hearts who once hid behind pride and timing finally faced what was real. Maybe they reconnect. Maybe they don't. But now, there are no unfinished sentences hanging in the air. No questions that echo endlessly. Only a quiet understanding. That what was shared was real. That what was felt mattered. And that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is press send. Long after the screen goes dark, one thought remains. Some messages are read with the eyes. But a rare few are remembered by the heart. This was one of them. And somewhere, in another quiet room, a person who once feared losing everything is finally at peace. Not because they know the outcome. But because they know they were honest. And sometimes, honesty is the most unforgettable ending of all. There is something about midnight that makes truth impossible to ignore. When the noise of the world fades, when conversations end and notifications slow down, the heart begins to speak louder than usual. It asks questions that daylight easily distracts you from. It replays moments you thought you had already buried. It brings back names you pretend no longer affect you. And tonight, of all nights, your name is the only one echoing in their thoughts. They never planned to write again. In fact, they once promised themselves they wouldn't. They told their friends they had accepted everything. They said time had done its job. They smiled when someone mentioned you, as if the story had neatly folded itself into the past. But healing is not always loud. And moving on is not always honest. Sometimes, what looks like strength is simply silence practiced well. The truth is, they tried to forget in all the ways people usually do. They stayed busy. They met new faces. They explored new routines. They convinced themselves that new beginnings automatically erase old chapters. But every new place felt slightly incomplete. Not empty. Just missing something familiar. It happened in small, inconvenient ways. When they heard a joke you would have loved. When they passed a place you once talked about visiting together. When something exciting happened and their first instinct was still to tell you. That instinct never adjusted. No matter how much time passed. There were nights when they opened your chat window and just stared. Not typing. Not scrolling. Just looking at the last message exchanged, as if it held clues to something they still didn't understand. They would whisper to themselves, "It's too late." And maybe it was. But the heart does not measure time the way calendars do. It measures impact. And your impact never reduced. There was a moment, weeks ago, when they almost sent a simple text. Not a confession. Not a dramatic paragraph. Just, "I hope you're doing well." They typed it. Read it. Deleted it. Because even something that small felt like reopening a door they had spent so much effort closing. They were not afraid of your anger. They were afraid of your indifference. Anger means there are still emotions alive. Indifference means the story truly ended. So they chose to protect themselves from that possibility. But protection often comes at the cost of honesty. One evening, while cleaning out old files, they found something unexpected. A note saved under a random name. They almost deleted it without opening it. Almost. Inside was a message they had written months ago and never sent. It was raw. Unfiltered. Full of questions and vulnerability. Reading it felt like meeting an earlier version of themselves. A version that was braver in emotion but weaker in courage. They noticed something. Even in that old draft, the tone wasn't about getting you back. It was about being understood. They realized then that this was never about possession. It was about connection. About not wanting to become strangers after sharing something that once felt infinite. That realization changed everything. They began rewriting again. Not from a place of desperation. but from clarity. They removed every sentence that sounded like pressure. They erased every line that tried to make you feel guilty. They kept only what felt undeniably true. It took days. Not because the words were difficult, but because they wanted them to be pure. They did not want this message to be influenced by loneliness, ego, or impulse. They wanted it to be steady, honest, final, in the best possible way. And so the message grew slowly. It began with gratitude. Not for the ending, but for the experience. They wrote about how you changed them. How loving you made them more patient. How losing you made them more self-aware. How the silence taught them the cost of pride. They admitted something they had never said before. During the time apart, they often replayed the last real conversation you had. Not the short replies at the end. Not the polite check-ins. The last deep one. They realized now that both of you were scared that day. Both of you were waiting for the other to fight harder. Both of you mistook hesitation for lack of care. And that misunderstanding quietly shaped everything that followed. If only one of you had spoken more clearly. If only one of you had admitted the fear instead of masking it as independence. But, if only, is a painful place to live. So they stopped living there. Instead, they focused on what could still be said now. The message continued. They confessed that they once believed love had to be dramatic to be real. That grand gestures mattered more than quiet consistency. But losing you taught them something deeper. Real love is not loud. It is steady. It is choosing someone even when things are complicated. It is speaking even when your voice shakes. They admitted they failed at that before. Not because they didn't care, but because they cared so much that they feared ruining it. And fear, when left unspoken, becomes distance. There was one line in the message that took them the longest to write. I never stopped loving you. I just stopped knowing how to show it. They rewrote that sentence at least 20 times. They worried it sounded manipulative. They worried it sounded too late. But it was true. And truth was the only thing allowed to remain. The message did not ask for a reunion. It did not ask for promises. It simply asked for understanding. For the chance to let you know that what you shared was never taken lightly. That every memory was respected. That every lesson was valued. They wrote about growth. How time apart forced them to confront their own insecurities. How they realized they often shut down instead of communicating. How they confused strength with emotional distance. And how meeting you exposed that flaw in a way no one else ever had. You were not just someone they loved. You were someone who revealed parts of them they didn't know needed healing. And that is not something easily forgotten. The night they finally decided to send it was ordinary. No special anniversary. No dramatic trigger. Just a quiet acceptance that waiting for the perfect moment was another form of avoidance. Their hands trembled slightly. Not because they expected rejection, but because vulnerability, even when chosen, is never comfortable. They pressed send. And in that second, something inside them shifted. Regardless of what you would say, or not say, they had done what they once believed was impossible. They had chosen honesty over fear. After sending it, they did not stare at the screen. They placed the phone down, took a deep breath, and felt something surprising. Relief. Not because the story was fixed, but because it was no longer unfinished. For the first time in a long time, there were no unsent words weighing on their chest. They had given the truth a voice. And that alone felt powerful. Hours later, they checked their phone. No reply yet. Their heart beat faster. Then slower. Then steady again. They reminded themselves that the purpose of the message was never control. It was closure through courage. Whether you respond with warmth, confusion, silence, or even goodbye, at least now the foundation is real. Because relationships may end. But truth should not remain buried. Days might pass before you answer. Or maybe you already have. Maybe your response was simple. Maybe it was emotional. Maybe it was unexpected. But whatever happens next, one thing is certain. This message changed 2 lives. It changed yours, because it reminded you that you were loved deeply, even in silence. And it changed theirs, because they finally stopped hiding behind pride. The most beautiful part of this story is not the possibility of reunion. It is the evolution. 2 people who once struggled to communicate have now learned the value of transparency. 2 hearts who once let fear dictate their choices have now witnessed what bravery feels like. And bravery does not always look like chasing someone. Sometimes it looks like speaking your truth and accepting whatever follows. Long after the conversation continues, or ends, the impact remains. You will remember this message years from now. Not for its length. Not for its timing. But for its sincerity. Because in a world full of half-feelings and temporary connections, someone chose to give you something complete. Something unguarded. Something real. And whether this becomes the first page of a new chapter or the final line of an old one, it will always stand as proof of one undeniable fact: when love is genuine, it eventually finds its voice. Even if it has to travel through months of silence. Even if it arrives later than expected. Even if it risks everything just to say, "This mattered." Because some stories are not defined by how long they last. They are defined by how deeply they are felt. And this one was felt in every quiet moment, every unsent draft, every midnight confession that finally became brave enough to exist outside the heart that carried it for so long. So if you are holding your phone right now, rereading those words, wondering what they mean for tomorrow, know this. The greatest love stories are not the ones without fear. They are the ones where fear is finally overcome. And tonight, somewhere between silence and courage, a heart chose truth. That choice alone is enough to change everything. There is still more to this story. Because the moment after courage is just as important as the courage itself. After the message was sent and the silence settled in, something unexpected began to unfold, not on the screen, but inside the heart that had finally spoken. For the first time in years, they slept peacefully. No imaginary conversations replaying in their mind. No alternate endings haunting them. No, what if I had said this, echoing at 2 a.m. Just rest. That is what honesty does. It may not guarantee reunion. It may not promise happy endings. But it gives rest. The next morning felt strangely light. The sky looked the same. The routine was unchanged. Coffee still tasted ordinary. But there was a difference. A subtle shift. Like removing a heavy backpack you forgot you were carrying. They realized something profound. For so long, they thought they were afraid of losing you. But what they were truly afraid of was losing the chance to be real. And now, that fear no longer controlled them. Hours later, your phone buzzed. You saw their name. And in that instant, time folded in on itself. Memories returned, not painfully, but vividly. The first conversation. The first disagreement. The quiet comfort of shared silence. The way things slowly became complicated without either of you fully understanding how. You hesitated before opening the message. Not because you didn't care. But because you did. You were not prepared for how calm the words felt. You expected drama. You expected apology after apology. You expected urgency. Instead, you found sincerity. And sincerity is harder to ignore than emotion. You read it once. Then again. Then a third time, slower. You noticed the absence of blame. You noticed the gratitude. You noticed that nowhere did it say, "You owe me a response." It simply said, "This is my truth." That unsettled you, in the most honest way. Because deep down, you also had truths you never voiced. You also had nights where you almost reached out. You also replayed that final real conversation and wondered how two people who cared so much managed to misread each other so completely. You had your pride too. Your fear too. Your silence too. And now, faced with their vulnerability, you felt your own walls tremble slightly. The message did not demand that you tear them down. It simply knocked. Softly. You placed your phone face down. Walked to the window. Took a breath. Because responding meant stepping into honesty as well. And honesty is never comfortable. It requires admitting things you once denied. It requires acknowledging that timing is not always the villain, sometimes ego is. Sometimes fear is. Sometimes immaturity is. You realized something else. When things ended, you both focused on who pulled away first. Neither of you focused on who was hurting more. And pain, when unspoken, turns into misunderstanding. You returned to the phone. Your fingers hovered above the keyboard. What do you say to someone who just handed you their unfiltered heart? You don't respond with strategy. You respond with truth. So you began typing. Not perfectly. Not poetically. But honestly. You wrote that you never hated them. You wrote that you were hurt, but mostly confused. You admitted that part of you believed they stopped fighting because they didn't care enough. You confessed that you built strength around that assumption, because believing they cared would have made it harder to let go. You told them that you also replayed the past. That certain songs still carried weight. That certain places still felt familiar in a way that no one else understood. And then you paused. Because the next sentence mattered most. I never stopped wondering what would have happened if we were braver. You stared at that line for a long time. Then you pressed send. And just like that, the story shifted again. Not into a fairy tale. Not into a dramatic reunion. But into something far rarer. Mutual clarity. The conversation that followed was not rushed. It did not attempt to solve everything in one night. It unfolded slowly. Like two people carefully unpacking something fragile. They talked about timing. About growth. About the ways they both changed since the silence began. You both acknowledged mistakes, without turning them into weapons. You both admitted fear, without letting it control the present. There were moments of laughter. Moments of quiet. Moments where you realized how much maturity had grown in the space between you. And here is the truth no one talks about: sometimes, distance is not the end. Sometimes, it is the lesson. It teaches you what pride costs. It teaches you that assumptions are dangerous. It teaches you that love without communication is like a book without pages. It exists, but it cannot be read. As days turned into weeks, something unexpected happened. The pressure disappeared. There were no immediate promises. No dramatic declarations. Just consistent conversation. Honest conversation. You learned about each other again. Not as the people you were, but as the people you became. And that is where the real transformation lived. Because love is not just about holding on to who someone was. It is about discovering who they are now. There were still fears. Of course there were. What if things fall apart again? What if history repeats itself? What if courage fades? But this time, fear was discussed, not hidden. And discussing fear removes its power. One evening, during a simple conversation about nothing extraordinary, you both felt it. Not nostalgia. Not longing. But comfort. The kind that does not beg for attention. The kind that does not demand certainty. Just two hearts existing without armor. You realized then that the biggest difference between before and now was not love. Love had always been there. The difference was emotional courage. Before, you both expected the other person to speak first. Now, you both understood that waiting costs too much. There came a moment, a quiet one, when you both acknowledged something without needing to say it directly. If this story continues, it will continue differently. Slower. Wiser. Without ego leading the way. And if it does not continue romantically, it will still stand as something meaningful. Because closure achieved through honesty is a gift. Weeks later, you looked back at the original message. The one that almost never got sent. You realized something extraordinary. The power of that message was not in its length. It was in its intention. It was written without manipulation. Without trying to force destiny. It simply said, "Here is my heart. Do with it what you will." And that is the purest form of love. Not possession. Not control. But offering. There is something deeply powerful about two people choosing maturity after misunderstanding. It does not erase the past. It redeems it. Because pain that leads to growth is not wasted. One night, long after everything felt steady again, you asked them something simple. What made you finally send it? They thought for a moment. Then replied, I got tired of being the only one who knew how much you meant to me. That answer stayed with you. Because sometimes the heaviest burden is unexpressed love. Not rejection. Not endings. But silence. And maybe that is the real lesson in all of this. Not every story gets a second chance. Not every confession receives a reply. But every heart deserves the chance to speak without fear. Whether this becomes forever or becomes peace, one thing is undeniable: you both are no longer the people who let pride win. You both are no longer the versions who avoided difficult conversations. And that evolution alone makes this chapter meaningful. If someone were to ask what changed everything, the answer would be simple. One person decided that regret was heavier than vulnerability. And pressed send. From that single action, clarity was born. From clarity, understanding. From understanding, possibility. And possibility is where hope lives. The story is still being written. Not in dramatic gestures. Not in cinematic moments. But in daily choices to communicate. To listen. To be transparent. Because the strongest relationships are not the ones that never break. They are the ones rebuilt with stronger foundations. And if one day, years from now, you both sit together remembering how close you came to permanent silence, you will smile. Because you will know this truth: the most important message was never the longest one. It was the bravest one. The one that refused to let fear write the ending. And whether this journey becomes a lifetime or a beautiful season, it will always stand as proof that when love is real, it does not disappear quietly. It waits. It learns. It gathers courage. And when the moment is finally right, it speaks.